Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. This is your host, Scott Spratt from Sports Info Solutions. I'm joined, as always, by Aaron Schatz of Football Outsiders. Before we get going with today's show, I just want to remind everyone that the Off the Charts Football Podcast is presented to you by FantasyInsiders.com, your source for daily fantasy sports content. They believe that accuracy matters, and it shows since they've won the daily fantasy accuracy competition for the past 3 seasons. If you're serious about DFS or want to become serious, head over to FantasyInsiders.com for free educational content and premium memberships. Well, Aaron, last week was really interesting, the first week of the playoffs. We talked on the show last week about how good all of the road teams were, and 3 of those 4 road teams were favored, and then all 4 won. This week, we have a bit of a different situation where all of the home teams are favored, but just judging by some of the DVOA numbers, I'm thinking we might have some disagreements here on which teams might actually win these games. But let's run through them one game at a time in the order that they'll be televised like we did previously. And so things start with the Chiefs at the Patriots on mid-afternoon Saturday. The Patriots are 5-point favorites. In a lot of ways, this game sort of tickled my interest the most from an advanced stats perspective. And thanks to your DVOA article that really brought to life last week about how interesting that Chiefs performance was. So last week, the Chiefs had a 123.4% DVOA for the game. And Aaron, that's right, that's the best by any team in a game all season, even beating out what Seattle did to Arizona in Week 17. That's right, yes?
Yes, which is pretty incredible. You know, some of that is what's really remarkable is that the opponent adjustments for playing Houston are basically nil because they're kind of an average team. So the fact that that performance was better than what Seattle did to Arizona, considering how strong the opponent adjustments are for playing Arizona, was a bit of a surprise.
Well, as much as any team can win 10 straight games and sneak up on people, I feel like that's where the Chiefs were a week ago. But, you know, winning the way that they did in the playoffs when a lot more people were watching, I think it's probably changed a few people's minds about how good the Chiefs are. But one thing that I want to talk about a little bit was specific to that performance against the Texans. You wrote in your article about how special teams had a lot to do with that win. And obviously the Nile Davis kickoff return for a touchdown was big, and it started the game off in a big way. But were there other factors on special teams that really helped the Chiefs have such a blowout win?
Right. It was just a huge special teams game in every way, right? Frankie Hammond had almost 20 yards per punt return. The Chiefs punter pinned the Texans inside their 10 twice and then inside their 23 times out of 4 punts. And Cairo Santos had 3 out of 3 on field goals, 2 of which were from 49 yards, touchbacks on every kickoff, which is impressive even indoors.
Oh, yeah.
So it was an amazing special teams performance. I thought it was one of the top 10 of all time, and then somebody went and looked it up for me, and it's not one of the top 10 of all time, but it was the best special teams performance in any game this year.
So obviously that contributed greatly to how good the overall game performance was. But, I mean, as much as there's a carryover of any of these things, I mean, Seattle in Week 17 demolished the Cardinals and then barely beat the Vikings last week. Obviously weather was probably a factor.
No carryover. No carryover.
So there's no carryover at all.
Like,
okay.
How many, you can go historically, and you can find so many examples of the no carryover thing. I remember the Raiders had a year where they destroyed the AFC Championship game before they played the Bucs in the Super Bowl in 2002. And then they went to the Super Bowl and they lost. And I remember these games where Peyton Manning, when he was with the Colts, would destroy Denver in the wild card round. Rock Alexander was playing a cornerback for them, and he just picked on him all game, and Reggie Wayne had 200 yards.
Yeah.
And then they went to the Patriots the next week, and forget that. That was a loss. There's so many examples in history, okay, of 2005 Panthers destroyed the Giants in the wild card round.
Oh, wait. So I don't like this example.
Did they make the Super Bowl that year?
No. Yeah, that was not a great example to come up with there. We could have gone somewhere else with that.
Sorry.
I'm already nervous enough, but we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, no carryover, that's fine. But just looking at weighted DVOA, the Chiefs are a much better team than the Patriots have been over the second half of the season. The Chiefs 46% compared to the Patriots 14.7%. That probably doesn't mean they're 3 times better, but they're significantly better. And The reason this is so interesting, I think, is because the Patriots are getting so many of their players back this week. Edelman's coming back, Amendola's coming back, linebacker Dante Hightower's coming back, Sebastian Vollmer's coming back, maybe even Chandler Jones is coming back. I'm not sure. I haven't seen any updates on that later this week.
We think he's coming back.
Okay.
We don't know what's up with the synthetic marijuana pills, but we think he's coming back.
But the point of it is, we've talked a lot about how weighted DVOA and full season DVOA are both similarly predictive of future performance, why that's kind of surprising at times, and why, just logically speaking, you might need to pick and choose your spots to figure out which one better applies. And I feel like the Patriots right now might be the perfect example of why that is the case. You've got to think the Patriots are going to be more like their full season team than they are their weighted DVOA team, just because of the roster they'll have on the field this week, right?
Yeah, I think most people agree with that. Certainly the line agrees with that. I will say that it's not just that the Chiefs are better than the Patriots in the weighted numbers. In the total season rating, the Chiefs are actually better than the Patriots by one spot. The Chiefs were 5th, and the Patriots were 6th. But obviously, most of the difference is in the second half of the season, in particular for the Patriots in the last few weeks of the season. And, the big player that was lost for the Patriots in that last few weeks was Julian Edelman.
Yeah.
Because there's two things that are going on here with Tom Brady, which is first, he has not found guys open. And it's a combination of, first, Edelman gets open faster and easier than anyone else. And second, that the blocking has not been as good. And if Vollmer is back, that should be an improvement on the blocking. Although, he's still going to be playing out of position. He's going to be playing left tackle. Their normal left tackle was lost halfway through the year. It's funny. The AFC, every team in the AFC that was a major contender lost quarterback for at least a game or two this year, except for these two teams. But the Patriots have lost pretty much everyone else.
That's absolutely true. It's a little bit kind of like Rodgers after losing Jordy Nelson and how his guys just aren't open. I think that's sort of manifesting itself for Brady and his yards per attempt numbers, where weeks 1 through 9, he threw for 8.3 yards per attempt. That's 5th among all starters this year, or over that period. But weeks 10 through 17, he declined to 7.0 yards per attempt, which is more or less the middle of the pack. We know Brady's not a middle of the pack quarterback, but sometimes when you don't have time,
still avoiding interceptions.
Yeah. So, he's playing better than that, obviously, but it's just the circumstances are definitely tough for them to succeed. But that could definitely change this week, or it can if the offensive line holds up and the other players that are coming back can play like their old selves. It'll be interesting to see.
Right, I was going to say he's still avoiding interceptions, but then again, nobody seems to avoid interceptions as well as Alex Smith, so don't expect to see a lot of interceptions in this game.
That's true. I'm going to give you a piece of trivia because I was doing some research about Roethlisberger, which will come up a little bit later in the show, but Alex Smith has the third lowest basically average depth of throw this year, and he's at the bottom of the league every year. But I wondered if you knew who the bottom of the starters was this year, the guy that threw the shortest passes on average in the league.
I'm not looking at it, so I'm totally guessing off the top of my head, but I'll bet you that you're bringing it up now because Tom Brady is pretty far down there.
Okay, yeah. He was a little bit ahead. He was in the bottom third of the league, but it was actually...
But I'll bet you Sam Bradford is pretty low.
It was Matt Ryan was actually the guy at the bottom of the list, which was a little bit surprising to me, but maybe a little bit less so than it would have been before the year. That's just a sort of interesting piece of trivia.
He only has one deep receiver, so...
Yeah. I get it, and it worked, but it's just interesting. And it's interesting for Brady, I feel like. Given the huge disparity in the DVOA, the weighted, and then the full season and such, I don't even know where that means that the DVOA would suggest you go with this game. Is this a game where you think the Chiefs have a better chance than the actual Vegas line is giving them?
I do. I will say that, for all 4 games this weekend, you do have to remember home field advantage is a thing. Having a week off is a thing. So those things do give advantages to the home teams in these games.
Yeah.
Including the Patriots. And I think that that's why the Patriots are properly favored. But I think that the line is too large, a little bit too large. I think that when you look at how well these teams have played over the course of the year and the way that they've trended, it's really hard to say that the Patriots are like definitively better than Kansas City right now. I think that what makes them better is they have a week off and they have the home field advantage. I know nobody believes in Alex Smith, but it's not about believing in Alex Smith. It's about believing in, Tom Bahali and Justin Houston and Eric Berry and Marcus Peters and the defense and the offense just kind of comes along, and hopes to score some points. And that's even more true without Macklin. I mean, there's a couple of other elements here. One is the offense will be missing its by far best wide receiver.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Which means that, we've been used to the last couple of weeks that the Patriots had basically one weapon, and that was their tight end. And now the Chiefs are going to basically have one weapon, and that's their tight end. And the other is that I do think that the Chiefs' rating is a little overzealous because they happen to be the team that was the beneficiary of when Peyton Manning's foot finally gave way and he threw 900 interceptions in Week 10. And so I think that there's a little bit of an artificial boost there, but not much of one. And I also, the other thing is, of course, Kansas City's offense is based actually very strongly around the run. And the Patriots have had a very strong run defense in the second half of the season. It was 10th overall for the whole year, but it was particularly strong in the second half of the season.
Interesting. That was a great teaser, by the way, about Peyton Manning, because we're definitely coming back to that topic. We haven't even talked yet about the benching yet, but we'll get to that when the time comes. For now, let's move on to the Packers at the Cardinals game this week. According to weighted DVOA, the Packers are definitely the worst team that slept in the playoffs, and that made sense until last week when they ran up the score on the Redskins. And I didn't know if there was anything you saw in that game, maybe by watching or statistically, that maybe indicated to you that the Packers were somehow breaking out of the funk they've been in for basically half the year, or whether you think this was maybe just a one-time matchup-related win.
Yeah, I think it was very matchup-related because I wrote going into this game, I wrote the preview for that game, and if you looked at it, it was, Washington had played a series of really bad defenses, and Green Bay had played a series of really good defenses. And for the most part, those performances that made us say what's wrong with the Green Bay offense were against really good defenses, except for Chicago.
Right.
And I guess Detroit not on Thanksgiving. Detroit was like a week before that, but Detroit got better on defense over the course.
Yeah, they had turned the corner by that point, I feel like.
Chicago was the one defense that you were like, there's no way this defense should be shutting down Green Bay. But other than that, I mean, Green Bay was shut down by all these really fine defenses, Carolina and Arizona and Denver. And you knew going into this game that Washington was not a good defense. They were really not a good defense against the run. That Green Bay's running game had been better over the course of the season. That the second half of the season, Eddie Lacy had averaged like 4.3 yards per carry and had been fine. I mean, not great, but fine. And so I think what happened is, Washington's offense couldn't get it going. But what the Green Bay offense did against the Washington defense was sort of as expected given where the Washington defense was. And now the Arizona defense is not in that same place. They're in a much different and much better place.
That's for sure. It's so hard to unpack this sort of stuff because of game flow and everything else, but I did find it interesting that the Packers generated 17 sacks, pressures, etc. Last week. On the year, they had the 8th most in football, and the Redskins allowed the 6th fewest in football. So it seemed like that was something that the Packers got going last week, that in the second half of the season, they weren't as good at generating those pressures. In fact, they only had 4 against the Cardinals in their Week 16 huge loss. But so I think that's kind of, I don't know, the Redskins on the year allowed fewer sacks and pressures than the Cardinals did.
Right.
But again, that could be so much influenced by the fact that the Redskins were ahead in a lot of the games against weaker opponents. They were playing worse defenses. It's just really hard to sort of figure that out.
And that played a big role in this game, right? Because Washington's offense, when they got better in the second half of the year, it was looking at some of the numbers. Kirk Cousins was like the best quarterback in the league when he was not under pressure. So as soon as Green Bay was putting him under pressure more than he was used to, that was it. That's it for the Washington offense.
Yeah. So it's a really
will they do the same thing against Arizona, or was it kind of a 1 week fluke? My guess is more like 1 week fluke.
Probably. I mean, it's like a stupid thing for me to even say, but it's like if the Packers can build a lead, then they can take advantage of maybe the biggest asset of their defense, which is the pass rush. That's really the opposite of what happened earlier in the year, and I mean, not even that long ago, a month ago, when the Cardinals won 38-8 at home again in that week too against the Packers. And in that game, the Cardinals, they got up and then they were able to run the ball a lot, 28 carries compared to 27 pass attempts that game. And the interesting thing about the Cardinals is that was sort of right when David Johnson was becoming this star that he's become over the last month of the season. But he only had 9 carries in that game, again, probably because of the blowout nature of the game. But just seeing how good Johnson's been leading up to the playoffs, I was curious how good Johnson has been by some of the advanced numbers, like maybe DYAR so far this season.
Yeah, I mean, he's been awesome. The game he had in, week 15 was the best game,
the 3-touchdown game.
By any running back this year. Was it 15 or 13 that he had the amazing game?
I was thinking it was 15, although really he had several of them in that set, so I'm not even sure.
I apologize for forgetting right now. I will say that over the course of the last 5 weeks of the season, if you look at the last 5 weeks of the season, he was second in receiving value, DYAR behind James White of the Patriots, and second in rushing value for those 5 weeks behind Matt Forte.
Wow, that's incredible. So
he's been really good. And I will say, that on the problem for Green Bay is that run defense is, of course, the weakness of their defense. We've kind of gotten used to that over the last few years. It's been years since Green Bay's ranked better against the run than against the pass. And for the year, they were 6th against the pass, 19th against the run, and I would think a little bit better even against the pass this week if Sam Shields is able to come back from his concussion that cost him the last couple games, including that he didn't play against Arizona.
It's not like the Cardinals needed an extra weapon, but Johnson seems like the real deal. It also seems like more evidence of the huge amount of evidence already that you probably shouldn't be drafting running backs super early in the draft when you can get guys like Johnson late.
Yeah, I was like, listen, Todd Gurley this year, that's swell, okay? But if you had a 50% chance of getting Todd Gurley and a 50% chance of Melvin Gordon, is that a good pick? I even think this year, everybody's going to be like, well, this year we showed that you should draft running backs in the first round because Todd Gurley. Really? How many games did the Rams win because of Todd Gurley? And by the way, there were 2 running backs taken in the first round, and the other one was terrible.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, okay. Well, I think that pretty much wraps it up for the Saturday games. Before we jump to Sunday, let me remind everyone again that the Off the Charts Football Podcast is presented to you by FantasyInsiders.com, your source for daily fantasy sports content. They believe that accuracy matters, and it shows since they've won the daily fantasy accuracy competition for the past 3 seasons. If you're serious about DFS or want to become serious, check out FantasyInsiders.com for free educational content and premium memberships. Aaron, trying to psych myself up for this conversation we're about to have because I think you're about to rain on my parade right now.
No, I'm not. I'm going to start it. I'm actually going to start you out right now by not raining on your parade. Ready?
Ready.
I think the Panthers are properly favored.
Yes. Barely favored.
I think Seattle's the better team, but I think that the Panthers, like I said, bye week advantage, home field advantage, and I know I'm not trying to harp on this. It's just that it's a big deal because Seattle has so many other advantages. Seattle playing at 10 a.m. on their own time clocks is an advantage, and not a huge one. And it's not like in every game. It's not like every Pacific time zone team always gets blown out when they play on East Coast time at 1 o'clock. But if you average out all the games, it costs Pacific time zone teams a point or 2 per game to have to play at 1 o'clock East Coast time. So when you put those elements all together, that's even the playoff odds report from Outsiders, which does not account for the whole 1 p.m. Time thing, favored the Panthers in this game, even though the Seattle is now our Super Bowl favorite. But in this game, Carolina actually won a higher percentage of the time. So I that's my good news for you, is that this is not like, oh yeah, Seattle's going to go in there and win easily. This is going to be a close game. I think it's a 50-50 shot. I'd give a slight edge to Carolina. I've been saying all year of Carolina is not as good as its record, that I almost feel like now I need to stop and point out that doesn't mean they're
still
not
good.
really good.
Absolutely true. And these teams have a recent history of playing each other for whatever reason. I guess just a scheduling quirk. They've played each other in the regular season, I think each of the last 3 years, and then they met in the playoffs once.
It's also a quirk of them being good.
True.
I mean, one of the things, I did this thing for ESPN Insider this week where we looked at the best teams over a 4-year span, kind of to track the 4 years of Seattle being number one in our ratings. We have all forgotten that Carolina was 12-4 in 2013.
I didn't forget.
They were third in DVOA. Like, this year seemed like such a surprise because last year they weren't very good. And the not being very good was emphasized because they ended up making the playoffs anyway. That we forget that 2 years ago they were really good. So the reason these teams keep playing each other is that they keep finishing first, so they have to play each other.
Fair point.
And they're going to play each other again next year because of the way the schedule works. And this is the new Brady Manning.
Wow.
We are going to be counting Russell Wilson, Cam Newton games with Roman numerals.
Interesting. I mean, they definitely have that kind of impact for me, but it's interesting that maybe that's going to be the public view. We'll just have to see how the game goes. Let me circle back to what you said earlier, because it seems a little contradictory at first, and I just want you to give a little bit of detail here. How is it that you favor Carolina in this game over the Seahawks, but the Seahawks are the most likely team to win this Super Bowl? Is that about their ability to go to face Arizona in Arizona, or is it about just on a neutral field in the Super Bowl, they're the best team, so they would get the bigger edge over whatever AFC team makes it?
It's about the idea that they have a bigger edge in the Super Bowl because their rating is so high right now.
Okay, yeah.
Their weighted rating in particular is so high right now that they are seen as a much better favorite in the Super Bowl than either Carolina or Arizona. I would think that Carolina's chances of winning at home against Arizona are a little stronger if we ignore what happened in Week 17. In other words, if we were a playoff odds equation and didn't know what happened 2 weeks ago, I would say Carolina's chances of winning at home against Arizona are slightly better than Seattle's chances of winning on the road in Arizona. Now, knowing what we know about a couple of weeks ago, I wouldn't say that was true. But that being said, there's plenty of examples of teams that have a blowout during the regular season and then come back a couple weeks later in the playoffs, and it's not a blowout. One example, of course, being Seattle just now against Minnesota. And it doesn't even have to be playoffs. Look at what happened with Carolina this year, where they destroyed the Atlanta Falcons and then came back 2 weeks later, played them again, and lost.
So true. And so maybe the first game that the Seahawks and Panthers played together this year might not mean a ton either, I guess. But it was an interesting game, and I think just strategically interesting too, because of how much tight ends were a major factor in this game. For the Panthers, Greg Olsen had 7 catches for 131 yards and a touchdown. He also had the game-winning catch in the fourth quarter. But meanwhile, Jimmy Graham, in one of the few really great games that he had for the Seahawks before he got hurt, had 8 catches for 140 yards and basically had almost half of the team's 18 total receptions on the day. So from the Seahawks perspective, they have sort of 2 interesting challenges, I guess. One is, what is sort of game plan they're going to take into it offensively now that they're, I guess, the player they thought was the biggest weapon against Carolina isn't on the field. And then 2, what they can try to do to slow down the Panthers' tight end attack. And I've got some random information about this, and I'm not sure how much of it's sort of applicable, but you can tell me what you think just based on what you hear, Aaron. Doing some research, I found the Panthers use 1 running back, 2 wide receiver, and 2 tight end formations 35% of the time, 4th highest in football. And they had the 6th highest yards per attempt in that formation of any team in football. It was kind of interesting because when I was looking at that leaderboard, the Rams were 5th in yards per attempt in that formation. And again, the Rams actually they beat the Seahawks twice this year.
The Rams go double tight end with Cook and Kendricks a lot.
So it seems like at least with those teams, that was an effective strategy against the Seahawks. But basically any defensive number you look up for the Seahawks this year, they're great. And overall, they're great at defending 2 tight end sets. But I just didn't know if there was maybe anything there with the style of approach that was maybe working, or maybe that's all just fueling the running game. I'm not sure what it means. Do you have any thoughts related to that?
Well, I mean, as far as the tight ends themselves, right? So there's the two sides of this. As far as the Jimmy Graham being a huge part of their passing attack in that game, I think that they've shown that the passing attack doesn't need him. Since then,
they've been a lot better, sure.
And as far as the Carolina defense goes, that was a huge fluke. Carolina has been the number one defense against tight ends this year by DVOA. They allowed 140 yards to Graham. They did not allow more than 63 yards to a tight end in a game in any other game this year. Zach Ertz, the week afterwards, had 63. Otherwise, no other tight end has had more than 52 yards in a game against Carolina. So that seems like a bit of a fluke and a bit of a like a little mid-season thing there where they were suddenly giving up a few yards to tight ends. But for most of the year, they've totally shut down tight ends. If Graham was healthy right now, I would be saying, well, there's very unlikely that he's going to repeat that performance given what Carolina does against tight ends. So that's not really that much of a worry for Seattle. The other side is a huge worry because that was the clear weakness of the Seattle defense all year long was covering tight ends.
Yeah.
Not only Olsen in that game, but Tyler Eifert, 90 yards. Cook from
the Rams, yeah.
From the Rams in the first game had 85 yards. Vance McDonald in Week 11. Vance McDonald, for crying out loud, 65 yards. The Seattle was number 26 in DVOA against tight ends. The number of passes attempted to tight ends was actually fairly low, especially once Cam Chancellor came back. But the tight ends, that's the weakness of the Seattle defense, has been covering tight ends, and that's a real problem when you're playing against Greg Olsen.
Well, good. I can feel a little bit better about having at least one matchup favor on the Panthers side of things. But
I'll say one other thing I want to get to as far as this game and sort of the whole Seattle as Super Bowl favorite thing as being really weird.
Yeah.
I went back and looked because I've got the records of our playoff odds report going back just to 2010. Unfortunately, I don't have before that. But we've never had anything like this where a wild card team was the favorite to win the Super Bowl at this point. And in fact, I think the top two or three favorites right now, like out of the top favorites, it's like Kansas City is the AFC favorite right now. We've never had anything like this.
Interesting.
Like the last 3 years, when we got to this point, the four home teams, the teams with the top two seeds, were all 15% or better to win the Super Bowl. In 2011, there were the Saints who finished the year in weighted DVOA, but were the number 3 seed. That they were one of our top Super Bowl contenders at that point. But again, they're not a wild card team; they were a 3 seed.
That's a big difference, obviously.
In 2010, we had Baltimore because they were a wild card because they were tied with Pittsburgh at 12-4, but lost the tiebreaker, and they were among the teams with the top chances to win the Super Bowl. But we've never had anything like this as far as like the odds of winning the Super Bowl. We've never seen it as being this even between so many teams, and we've never seen this good a chance that a wild card team would win a Super Bowl at this point in the playoffs.
That's fascinating. And hopefully that'll make for some good football games, too.
Right, but of course, the team that you would like to see beat that team is Kansas City, and the team that I would like to see beat that team is Seattle. So if we're both lucky, both Seattle and Kansas City will lose this weekend.
Yep, otherwise we'll have at least one depressed host next week. But let's worry about that when the time comes. We've got one more game to cover this week, which is the Steelers at Broncos. And, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that the Steelers' injury situation is the major storyline with this game at this point.
Both injury situations. I feel like this is the game I've said, if you live in a place where wagering is legal, please do not wager on this game for any reason, because I have no clue. Look, numbers, we can run all the numbers we want, but nothing will tell us, will Roethlisberger play? How good will he be? What can he do? Is Antonio Brown playing? Peyton Manning. Which Peyton Manning are we getting? How much does that game against Kansas City matter? How much do the first 8 weeks of the season matter? Will Osweiler play if Peyton Manning struggles early? Like, I have no idea.
So obviously that's all up in the air, but you're going to have to just humor me here as I go through some of these numbers, and we're just going to have to figure out how much stock to put in these things as it gets clearer as the time comes. But the first thing I wanted to start with was over the last drive in wild card week when Roethlisberger was going to, I guess, lead the eventual game-winning drive on that crazy Bengals game, but he looked like he wasn't willing to go down the field. And it's hard to know whether that was defensive strategy, trying to get him to keep the ball short, to let clock expire or what. But given the separated shoulder, it seems like that might be a problem for him to go down the field accurately in this game. And I was curious how much of a big deal that you think is for Roethlisberger, given their normal approach to the game, and given the Broncos' defense, and if they have any weaknesses, if that's a weakness going down the field.
Yeah, it's a huge weakness because Pittsburgh threw downfield more than any other team this year. If you look at each team and the percentage of passes that went 16 or more yards through the air, Pittsburgh and Arizona are tied first in 25.5% of passes. If you only look at Roethlisberger, it drops slightly to 24.4, I think, percent of passes, but still, it's a big part of his game. It's a successful part of his game. Antonio Brown, part of what makes him amazing is that he is the best receiver in the game right now, both short and deep passes, whereas, Julian Edelman is so great at short and Julio Jones is so great at deep, but Antonio Brown can do both.
Yeah, that is amazing.
And the other thing is that if you look at the defense for the Denver Broncos, they were number 1 this year against short passes. They were number 7 against deep passes, with a particular weakness against deep passes down the right sideline. And I realized that saying particular weakness for Denver is not really like saying weakness.
Right.
Sort of like with Seattle.
Seattle's tight end coverage,
but
right?
Look,
yeah.
You'll take what you can get.
Absolutely.
And if Roethlisberger can't throw downfield, this is not a defense that you want to be doing nothing but short passes against. I think that's part of why they were able to beat the New England Patriots because, Brady doesn't throw deep as much. And short passes, they kill short passes. Denver kills your short passes.
Yeah.
So if that's all Roethlisberger can throw...
Trouble. Absolutely.
Trouble. They're going to be depending on Peyton Manning breaking down, which is not a bad thing to depend on right now. But
speaking of, and again, we don't really know if Peyton will be different after he's had so much time off to hopefully get healthier. But just looking at their full season standard numbers, Peyton had 6.8 yards per attempt this year, 9 touchdowns, 17 interceptions. 17, by the way. Osweiler had 7.2 yards per attempt, so a little bit higher, 10 touchdowns and 6 interceptions. Just looking at those, it looks kind of like a mistake to bench him and to go with Manning in this game. I was curious if DYAR might paint a bit of a different picture. Is Manning, did he have a better season than Osweiler by that measure, or do you think this is more just they want to ride with a guy with a little bit more experience in these type of situations?
Nope, this all seems to be about playoff experience. There's no question that this year, Brock Osweiler was better than Peyton Manning. And it is true even if you do not count the game against Kansas City where Manning threw all those interceptions.
Yeah.
Let's take out that game, right? So we're looking regular season now. I'm not looking at the playoff game because I don't have that spreadsheet open while we're talking, but we're looking regular season. Osweiler, 103 defense-adjusted yards above replacement. DVOA says 5% below average. Manning, this is without the Kansas City game, minus 95. DVOA says 15.7% below average. There's no question, even if you take out the Kansas City game. And you also have to consider, I guess you have to ask the question, I guess not consider this, but rather ask this question. Why did the Denver running game improve in the second half of the year? Did it improve because Kubiak finally got these guys to understand his blocking scheme and that they fiddled with who the linemen were? Or did it improve because Osweiler can run Kubiak's scheme better? Now, when Manning, I would have said it was the scheme thing. But then Manning came in last week and the run blocking was spectacular.
Yeah.
That's what won that game,
Absolutely.
was the run blocking, not Manning. So if the run blocking can be that good, then that's a very strong thing. Except the problem is Pittsburgh's defense this year was better than people realize and was 5th against the run by DVOA, 15th against the pass. The weakness of the Pittsburgh defense is the cornerbacks and going deep against them. And if you look, those things I said about, Denver is number 1 against the short pass and 7th against the deep pass. Pittsburgh is 8th against the short pass and 26th against the deep pass.
Wow.
So you want to be able to throw deep. How much throwing deep is Peyton Manning going to be doing right now? Not much.
That's hilarious. I mean, both offenses have the exact wrong approach for the teams that they're facing on defense here. That'll be really interesting.
Oh, and by the way, This is also the exact wrong approach for New England or Kansas City, right? So if Denver or Pittsburgh makes it to the Super Bowl, they are going to get Arizona and even Carolina, Seattle certainly, they're going to go deep. But Jermaine Kearse will have 150 yards against one of these defenses, or Ted Ginn will have 150 and he'll drop another 100.
For sure about that one.
They're all short pass offenses right now in the AFC.
Well, the thing about the Steelers, you're right that it was not something that I realized how good defensively they were, even though we actually talked about this earlier in the year about how they had been improved. But way to DVOA, they're the 6th defense in the league. That's kind of shocking to me. In the wild card game, obviously Ryan Shazier was the one making a huge impact with the stripped fumble that he had and some of the other great plays that he had. But are there other players on their defense that have been making improvements that have sort of led to this renaissance for the Steelers defense? Yeah,
I think you see, like I said, it's the front seven. It's all about the front seven.
Yeah.
Steven Tuitt has been great this year. Cam Hayward is great. I know that the charting from Sports Info Solutions has them each with over 25 sacks plus pressures.
Yep, and James Harrison too.
James Harrison, who seems ageless. It's amazing to think he was close to retiring.
I know.
And I will also point out Jarvis Jones, not because he's been great, but because he has not been terrible. And he seemed like a total bust. But he's been a reasonably useful player this year. Perhaps not quite up to his first-round draft status, but he's a player who's useful. And when you have this many useful players in a front seven, you still have Lawrence Timmons.
Yeah.
You're getting really great run defense and a quality pass rush.
So just as we expected before the year, Roethlisberger versus Peyton Manning, it's going to be a defensive slugfest this week. So
it's so true. Really ridiculous, but it's so true. These with the Roethlisberger injury, it is really, these teams are really badly structured to face each other's defense.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm interested to watch all of these games. I'm going to wish you best of luck, Aaron, for your team, and best of luck to my team as well. Hopefully we'll both be alive as the playoffs continue next week. And I'll plan to talk to you then. In the meantime, have a great one. Thanks for everyone that listened, and please subscribe to the Off the Charts Football Podcast on iTunes. We will catch you next week.